Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and today on the Afternoon Light podcast, I'm joined by Anne Henderson, who is the Deputy Director of the Sydney Institute. She is also the author of several books on Australian politics, including Enid Lyons, Leading Lady to a Nation, Joseph Lyons, the People's Prime Minister, and Menzies at War, which was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Australian History Prize in 2015. But she's also the author of a brand new monograph on Dame Margaret Guilfoyle, which has just been published by Concord and about which we will speak today. So welcome to Afternoon Light, Anne.
Hi there, Georgina. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, it's an absolute pleasure, Anne. And I wanted to start our discussion by really talking to you about Dame Margaret Guilfoyle's upbringing, because she came from really interesting background. She wasn't born in Australia, was she? She was born in Northern Ireland in Belfast and was a migrant. But she didn't have the easiest of starts to life, which often is the case for people who end up being brilliant. Oh, and I should also say, why we are talking about her is she is one of the many Liberal women who were women of firsts in Australia. First woman to hold a cabinet-level ministerial portfolio in Australia and the first woman to hold a major economic portfolio, and she was a Liberal senator for Victoria. So a pretty brilliant woman. But tell me about her tough upbringing, Anne.
Well, she used to say that in terms of her background status as a migrant, she could have ticked all the boxes for a migrant except being able to speak English. And it's true. Yeah, she was born in Belfast and her father was in the constabulary, where for possibly reasons of his health, they chose to come out to Australia when Margaret was about 3. She was born in 1926. And they came to Victoria and settled in Alphington or thereabouts. And he wasn't well. He got a job, but when she was about 10, he died.
Oh.
And that left her mother with, Margaret had an older brother and then a younger sister that was born about the time, not long after they arrived in Australia. So there was a mother with 3 children under 12. And in those days, she possibly had some kind of work pension if he had been in the state public service, or just a widow's pension. It wouldn't have been a very large amount of money, and they were renting, they didn't have a house of their own. And so the mother brought the 3 of them up, and Margaret says they were rich in everything except money. She was obviously one of these very capable mothers who could save a penny every turn of the moment. I think she'd been a teacher of some kind. And she was bright, read stories to the children. Margaret talks fondly of the neighbourhood kids. They roamed in packs. They had a park across the road. She remembers her father's funeral as being, or the week he died, was the Melbourne Cup, and she missed the Sunday school celebrations for the Cup because it was a week of mourning for them. And so it was a great community, and they were Presbyterian at a time when the church was very involved in their social life. So from the very outset, she knew what it was like to go without and struggle, but very strong bonds of community and strong family bonds. And that's how Margaret grew up.
And she was obviously, someone who believed in herself and her own capacities. She put herself through secretarial college, didn't she? She has studied accountancy. She obviously wanted to make a real life for herself, and of course those Presbyterian roots would have encouraged a strong sense of the importance of education. All
true. She would have gone on to university in a different setting. There was no way that she was going to be able to afford to go to university. So she set off to do night school, and funnily enough at school she was very interested in ancient history and all of that. So she had a broadened interest in education, and she always spoke in life of being given taking the opportunity of a first chance. So this was the war years by the time she was starting out in employment, and she had various accountancy jobs. She'd done accountancy at night school. Then she went on to do her study for chartered accountancy. And because it was the war years, she was able to get a position as a chief accountant in a fairly large firm. And from there, she learned how to manage. She managed the whole of the figures. For a young girl, I suppose she was in her early 20s, she got the confidence of being able to do the work that mostly or largely have been done by men. And she met her husband-to-be, Stan Guilefoyle, at night school in the last years, her last years of study, which was just after the war. And he'd been flying for the RAAF, and he'd flown with the Americans, and he'd come back and he'd decided to go into accountancy or to finish his studies, and that's how they met. Look, she was very like Enid Lyons in that she was bright to start with, but she called herself a woman of her day or woman of her times. But she wasn't a woman of her times in terms of what she achieved. But they were women who didn't set out with a blazing idea of where they wanted to go, but they took the opportunities. With Enid Lyons, it was really like hurdles. She jumped them. But they took the opportunities that they had. They never balked. They never said, oh, I couldn't possibly do that. I've got children, or I couldn't possibly do that. I'm just a woman. They just took whatever came their way. And that's what she meant by first chance. Given the opportunity, she took it.
Just and by the sounds of it, incredibly pragmatic person too. She wasn't sort of too, wound up about ideologies or I guess what society was telling her she could or couldn't do. She just, made do with her circumstances and her skills and her incredible abilities, let's be honest. And she must have had great self-belief too, because she would have no doubt come up against various forms of sexism throughout her employment, where people would have questioned her role in the accounting profession as a woman, and perhaps questioning whether she shouldn't have stayed at home with children.
Well, she never actually spoke about those sort of things. Funnily enough, one of the companies she worked with in the early part of her career and in the early part of the year was a Japanese firm that had to be closed down after Japan ended up at war with Australia.
Oh, amazing.
She said she always had really good relations with Japanese thereafter because she understood. This was the import-export trade. Look, she possibly did have that, but she never noticed it. And it's possible at the time she was rising, there was no chance of putting those questions because there was no competition much with men. But she managed the job. She did it well. Then when she married and had children, she went to working from home. She opened an accountancy business of her own. So she probably bypassed a lot of that. Later on, it would be in politics where she might have met with some of that male chauvinism or whatever we call it these days.
Tell me, Anne, what about her journey into politics? How did she get politically active? So, she's come from, her parents at least have come from Belfast. She's born there. She's not Irish Catholic. She's Presbyterian. So, she's coming from Ireland, a family of migrants. Yes, they're not part of Irish Catholic community, but, it's definitely you tend to think of Irish migrants to Australian as not on the liberal side of politics, as a sort of huge stereotype here. So it's interesting her journey into politics, but journey into the centre right as well.
Well, it's interesting partly because it didn't come from her family. Her family were very, I suppose, alert, well educated. Her dad died. She said that they never belonged to any political party where they lived because it was a Labor seat. And there was no, I suppose in those days would have been a United Australia Party place that they would have felt at home in. It was basically when she met Stan. Stan's mother was a real goer. She was a member of the AWN, the Australian Women's National League, AWNL.
With Elizabeth
and they
Couchman.
they lived in Essendon. And she was also a very good friend of Ivy Wedgwood, who she was involved with the AWNL in Essendon. Now, the AWNL was a ferociously amazing group of women. May Couchman, who had been the strength of the AWNL in Victoria, and the women of the AWNL were really a spine in some ways for the Liberal Party of Australia, because they had a network of women all over the state. And they were the ones who did a lot of the campaigning for the United Australia Party, and they were invaluable, and Menzies knew that and brought them in as a major force in the Liberal Party. Now, Ivy Wedgwood, and through Stan, Margaret got involved with the Liberal Party when she married. They lived in Umdale, I think, or Glen Iris, one of those suburbs, and they joined the local branch. I think they joined South Camberwell, and Stan was very involved, and his mother had enrolled him in the Liberal Party the minute it was formed. He was up flying for the forces, and the mother went down and enrolled him. So he was involved in the Liberal Party, and Margaret was involved too. And in fact, in those days, the Liberal Party must have been very exciting, because it was a young party, and a lot of the people that were the backbone of it were young people, and a lot of them were married couples. So much so that they passed a resolution at one of the branch meetings that something to do with, a married person couldn't vote for the other partner or some such thing, because there were so many of these couples. Then she began to get appointed to positions, and she was secretary of the women's division or something when she put herself forward for nomination. The whole idea of women getting into politics, I think, until recent times, the problem for the Conservative side of politics is that, unlike Labor, in those days, the Conservative side of politics were doing better with women, getting women into seats than, not many, but than Labor. Yes. Labor was much more male chauvinistic. In the Labor Party, there are all sorts of divisions and sections and whatever. So you can learn your way up. You become an apparatchik in the party. The women's section in Victoria was very strong. And so it was through the women's section that Margaret got her experience. And she knew how to do meetings. When she went to Parliament, she said she'd been up to Canberra, to Parliament House on a few occasions. She was quite familiar with it because she'd been there for the Liberal Party meetings. So she cut her teeth being part of the South Camberwell branch, and then part of the big organisation, secretary of the women's section, whatever. And when she nominated, when Ivy Wedgwood retired in 1970, she was at the same height of experience as Ivy Wedgwood was when she went into the Senate.
Now, Margaret Guilfoyle joined the Senate in 1971 as a senator for Victoria, but she was obviously politically active from the 50s, from the early 50s when she joined the Liberal Party, which is, of course, when Robert Menzies was Prime Minister until 1966. Did she have much to do with Menzies? I mean, was there something about Menzies as the leader that attracted her to the Liberal Party? I mean, beyond the fact that her husband Stan's mother had signed Stan up and therefore Margaret up.
It's very interesting as you do this research for a person from a state. The states are very important in the Liberal Party. What I found very interesting doing Margaret was that she had a number of personal connections with people who were Victorian Liberals. And the person that she said that influenced her a lot was Henry Bolte. And Henry Bolte gave her some idea of the value of service. And, of course, the states are in charge of all of that area. And I suppose, basically, she would have absolutely latched on to the Menzies idea of the small person being responsible for themselves, small business owner, the family, all of that stuff as well. And that was very much coming out of her Presbyterian background, which was also Menzies' background.
Yes.
And the Presbyterian background is also one that is asking for individual involvement and individual commitment to, whatever is the project that you're undertaking. It's less hierarchical than some of the other Christian religions. Anyway, she certainly values of individuality, but she also remarked on how she came to understand the value of service, and that included, when she became Social Services Minister, the idea that you have to take some responsibility for those who can't manage themselves. But she was very much against taking all responsibility. She didn't believe in the sort of social state kind of stuff. It's very interesting when you get to what she did with social services, how she managed to work around this one, but not that one.
But that abiding sense of a duty to others was obviously very, very important to
need
her.
That.
Yes,
that
were in need. Yeah. Tell me, Anne. Margaret Guilfoyle enters politics, and as a senator, you are very much involved in the committee work of the Parliament, of course. And she took a lot of committee roles that were in line with her professional experience, having been an accountant, which I guess was a little bit strange because when women were in politics, they were probably expected, particularly at that time, to be interested in so-called women's issues or the sort of softer portfolios. But that was not Margaret Guilfoyle's background. She did have an accounting background. She was interested in the economy, and she was interested in welfare issues as well. But she was really trying to eschew that kind of I'm just going to be there for just women. She was there for all Victorians, and also wanted to make the use of her incredible qualifications and experience, didn't she, when she was in the Parliament?
Her husband, Stan, was working with one of the big mining companies, Henderson Iron, I think. And it's quite interesting, when she got the nomination, which was, I think Stan was half hoping she didn't, they had a conflab round the table at the evening how they were going to manage, and I think it wasn't easy from all lots of things that were said.
I remember a similar conversation with my husband when I ran for Parliament, and I think he was quite happy.
It's always the women, though, isn't it? Yeah. It's always the women. But anyway, he said at one stage he was quite happy to end up being the Prince Philip type guy that walked 3 steps behind. But what he told her was, he said, don't go after things that are just for the women. You know what I mean? And he said, you've only had secretarial experience, you've now got to get political experience. So I think in many ways he was hard-headed enough behind her to sharpen her own pragmatic approach to things. And she got involved in some of the financial committees needed knowledge of mining. And she, in her maiden speech, she speaks quite a bit about mining and its contribution to Australia. And as time went on, that's how she did become much more experienced than the average female MP in areas which had been seen to be a man's domain. And mining was a big one. And, the private sector and the private sector's value to the state, which is what she did. But again, the thing that was very interesting in her early years was the Whitlam experiment. And being in the Senate, she saw it up close when the dismissal came. And there's quite some interesting stuff that she noticed that happened at that time. That November the 11th, 1975 was a pretty remarkable day for anyone who was in the Senate.
Yes, indeed. Did she have any particular anecdotes that she shared from that?
There are a couple there. Paul Kelly had a few, but they were very important because they had to hold the line, and there were a couple of senators who were wavering at the idea of blocking supply. And of course, she's mentioned a couple of times in Paul Kelly's book on the dismissal and her own recollections of how they held a couple of the senators strong in the face of the inevitable collapse of the Whitlam government.
Quite an extraordinary period, of course, in Australian political history, but would have been even more interesting being on the Senate floor at the time. And tell me, wanted to dig into Margaret Guilfoyle's achievements as a minister. She was firstly Minister for Social Security and then Finance Minister. What were her particular achievements, which were considerable, weren't they, during those two periods holding those portfolios? Well,
it's interesting. She did pretty well considering Malcolm Fraser, who was a mercurial figure. And I think it was only one occasion where he left her holding the baby. It was on, I think, funeral. They were going to discontinue the funeral allowance, which was about $40 or something, but there was reasons why it should be stopped because it was mostly went to people who didn't need it. But anyway, he backed down on that and left her holding the baby, having said he was going to end it. But where she was very successful, I spoke to some of the public servants who'd been working with her, and the Labor government under Hayden, not under Cairns, who was, I gather, a pretty hopeless treasurer, they had been thinking about the idea of ending the tax rebate for families and for income earners and switching it all over from the child endowment payment to a complete family allowances. Anyway, that hadn't got very far. When Margaret came in, she spearheaded that reform. And so under Margaret Guilfoyle, the government no longer would do tax rebates, because tax rebates mainly helped the people who had money. You had to have an income, you had to have a certain income to get the rebate. And it went to the fathers, whereas child endowment went to the mothers. So they moved it all over to a much bigger family allowance, which went to the mother. And that then really was important for families that were much more struggling families than in the previous arrangement. So that was her first big reform. She was also very good at getting Malcolm Fraser to say yes, which we look back on. Some people look back on and say yes, and that's the reason why the Fraser government got into such debt. Well, maybe. Considering what we now hand out from government, it wasn't very, very much. But it was a time of high inflation, and it was a time of increasing government spending, not being able to get on top of it. Even the Razor Gang in the 80s, it didn't do much. John Howard called it a damn squib, because the forces were such that inflation was raging. You know, anyone who doesn't know what inflation does, they'd better get out the textbooks and find out, because we're talking about it again in the United States.
Right. Yeah.
It is a beast, and every time you try to do something, it jumps at you, and you just get behind the eight ball. So Malcolm Fraser was bringing in a certain amount of tax deductions, and I remember because my husband Jared was working at that time for a minister in the Fraser government, and the frustration was that you gave a tax deduction, but people thought it was a salary increase, because wages had to keep going up to counter inflation, and as wages went up, employers found it harder and harder to pay the bills, and then they went out and on it went. So inflation is a nasty beast, but in the middle of all of that, Margaret managed to get Fraser to keep on backing her wish to keep the reforms going and keep the social welfare spending at a level that she thought was sufficient. And, you know, she'd get $1 billion out of him, and other people would be looking around in the cabinet room and thinking, how did she do that? Well, she did it.
What was her
and
secret,
on one occasion,
do you think? What was her
well,
secret?
on one occasion, they had come to an agreement in the ministry or the upper cabinet or whatever, that they were going to agree to what she wanted, $1 billion or something or other, or $7 billion, or I don't remember what the figure was. And Fraser was leaving to go overseas, and he didn't make the statement. So Margaret went out in front of the media and said, well, this has been agreed to. And she got herself the cool whatever $1 billion it was that she needed. So she was a really good operator. And because she was a Victorian and because Fraser was a Victorian, there was a great amount of respect between them, whether they would have had their differences on many occasions. But it was all done at a very professional level. And so Margaret certainly had Phil Lynch grinding his teeth. He was furious. He was the treasurer.
Tell me, Anne, what about her role in establishing daycare and out of school hours care? She was an instigator, wasn't she, in the Commonwealth's role in that those types of services? Yeah, there was a woman who was very much in the bureaucracy concerned with families and family care and whatever, and they got on really well. And this woman was quite a Labor person. But she spoke to me very warmly about Margaret and how they clicked over that. And there was one occasion they were trying to get this particular grant for women's refuges, and they had all the mothers and children up in Canberra, and they were meant to do it. And all Margaret would say was, "Don't worry, Margaret," to her friend or her bureaucrat, I'll fix it. And then she'd fix it, and then they were ready to have the gathering with the mothers and everything else. Margaret said, "Oh, don't worry about the minister. Let's go ahead." And so they got, and Margaret was like the mother. You know, she was handing out the cakes and the sandwiches and helping the mothers there. And they had a great celebration that they got this extra money for women's refugees. But you know, it was again, this is where women in politics make such a difference. I'm not saying that all women are terrific and all men are bad or anything like that. It's just that mixture of the ability to empathise with certain segments of society at the same time as being professional enough to work at the top to get the policy formulation right. Oh, I think her role in really sort of starting the growth of the modern childcare industry is extraordinary and very much underappreciated. And she would have had that experience as a working mother herself prior to entering politics, or, and of course, being in politics, and that understanding about the need to provide working mothers who were increasingly part of the workforce, of course, through the 70s and into the 80s, providing them with that support through these Commonwealth funded daycare centres. So, maybe other ministers would have done it in time, but I think we're very lucky that we had Margaret Guilfoyle in the Parliament and in the ministry too, to drive through those reforms, because they really were a game changer for so many working mums.
Yeah, and the key to it all too was that she got it done. I mean, Margaret Guilfoyle was very pragmatic, and her mind was always on the outcome. So it wasn't a matter of sitting around having a conflab, passing it over to the ministerial, to the bureaucracy, asking for them to come back with a recommendation, whatever. Margaret would work out the steps to getting it done and get it done. And she got it done often by being, quite cute about how she put out a statement or convinced a Prime Minister that this was going to have to happen. And I think many other ministers, I did talk to John Howard. He was very flattering and complimentary and whatever, but I often used to wonder whether he also ground his teeth occasionally at the money that was being spent. But look, it was the beginning of us taking much more care for the people who needed that support, And when people think about the Great Labor moment and Whitlam and all of that, it really didn't happen there. I mean, what I found as I looked at it was that what might have been the dreams of the Whitlamites, Margaret actually made them happen in the sense of those social welfare reforms.
Yeah, quite extraordinary. So she was obviously unusual, and there were no other women in cabinet, and she was quite a trailblazer, obviously. So she would have been remarkable in the photographs of the cabinet, and of course in in these sort of Australian political media landscape. But so she became an object of interest for journalists, didn't she? And her gender, of course, was a point of observation by the media. I understand when she was appointed to the Joint Prices Committee, the Herald newspaper in Melbourne described her as a housewife with a big say on prices. And then the Sydney Morning Herald, upon her appointment as Shadow Minister for Education, described her as a mother with political ambitions. And it was interesting reading that she was compared with Margaret Thatcher, who was, of course, politically active at exactly the same time. So Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, it was Dame Margaret Guilfoyle was the Iron Butterfly. So, but how did Margaret receive those comments and that sort of constantly being critiqued and examined through the lens of her gender?
She was tolerant. She obviously preferred not to have it. And there were times when she'd remark on not wanting it, and then the journalist would go away and use all the metaphors he could, comparing, metaphors about the home, metaphors about the mother, metaphors about that. But look, I think as I read Margaret, she just didn't make a fuss. If that's what the journalist was going to say, well, let him do it. I mean, the thing about those metaphors and those references, after they'd made all of that in their columns, they did get down to the meat and the sandwich. They whatever she was proposing or doing, it came across eventually. So she kind of put up with it, but she never lost the message. That's what she was doing, which I suppose was the contradiction of the iron butterfly. The iron bit got through as well as the butterfly. But it was a generation where if they were going to sort of make all that stuff, well, she'd put up with it, but she would still hammer home what it was she wanted to say, and she did. But, funnily enough, in politics, women are going to have to face that. I mean, when you look at what they do with males to get to the top, they've always got to be sort of compared to sort of arch fiends and strong heavyweights and all this kind of nonsense. It's always the metaphors.
Well, yeah, regardless of who you are and where you've come from, you're going to face a fair degree of criticism and backlash so, in politics.
And then if you're a man and they use homely metaphors, everyone says, oh, isn't that lovely? Oh, he does. Oh, he takes the kids to sport. Oh, isn't that wonderful? You know? What do you do? Can't win. So she sort of just, you know, it was like taking the mess and just pushing it aside and then thundering on. You know, she was good. I think the family managed, but I don't know how easy it was on the kids. Dan implied that it was tough on the kids. I didn't get too much. I didn't want really too much to know, but he gave me the impression that, you know, the kids. But they could have also been in an era when other kids' mothers didn't work, so that, you know, maybe their friends and whatever had mums at home and they thought they should. Who knows? But it wasn't easy what she did. And I think that she did it well, partly because she had a good partner back at base. Stan was a good partner back at base. And I think she enjoyed it. You know what I mean? It's nice to get away from the kitchen. I know Enid did. Enid loved getting on the boat and sailing out of Tasmania, leaving someone else to call the kids home from school or whatever.
So tell me, Anne, so Margaret was Minister for Social Security and then she became in 1980 Minister for Finance. So she's gone from being a minister who is spending a lot of taxpayers' money and incredibly adept at convincing the Treasurer and the Prime Minister to allow her to spend a lot of taxpayers' money on really innovative programs and progressive programs. And, you know, she was a trailblazer not only in her personal achievements but in her professional achievements in what she did for particularly Australian families. But she becomes Finance Minister and now she has to perform a very, very different role, almost the sort of complete opposite to what she's been doing, which is, you know, the bean counter of the cabinet. How did she marry those two experiences? It must have been quite a change of course.
As John Howard said, the Razor gang proved to be a damn squid. Howard obviously had ideas of how to cut, but he got overruled by the Prime Minister. And at one stage, Margaret was seen to be the sort of gatekeeper. She was the one that, you know, all the ministers had to, if they had a proposal that they wanted to put to cabinet, whatever, she had to sort of tick it off. And in one sense, I suppose she maybe stopped a lot of proposals going through. But look, the thing was, they didn't really cut. And that was the reason why, in the end, the Fraser government didn't succeed. It was a bad time. They didn't bring forward the proposals that Howard wanted to bring forward, which would have made him the mean and nasty treasurer. The elections around the corner. I think 3-year elections make it very hard. Those governments which have managed to pull the economy into shape and even get the deficit down, whatever, have surpluses, whatever. That's no mean feat. No mean feat at all, and that's why the Howard government was seen as being so successful. And by 1983, things really weren't going very well at all, and they lost. But Margaret did her job, as Margaret always did. But as I say, they didn't really cut very much, and her social services, social security, whatever, kept on going very happily.
Well, maybe in the end that was her intention.
Maybe. So. You wouldn't know.
She retired from politics in 1987, leaving an incredible legacy for the Australian Parliament, for Australian women, such an incredible role model. What do you think are the lessons that people can learn from Margaret Guilfoyle's example, both men and women? Political lessons, personal lessons, policy lessons. There must be so many.
Margaret Guilfoyle didn't sort of think she could wing it. She needed to brief herself thoroughly before she did something. And I think politics has become very difficult for a lot of people. But on the side of politics where people do well are the people who read and who understand what it is that they're talking about. They don't just make big splash. She was terrific at figures. John Howard and others that I spoke to, you know, she could cast her eye down a set of figures like a good accountant, and it didn't take her a minute to work out whether something didn't add up or whatever. People like Rod Kemp, who knew her, that, you know, she was terrific. You could take her a proposal from or something, or maybe a correspondence that's come back from the department, and she'd say, "Oh, they've changed the paragraph here." So she knew her job, and that's very important. And she didn't go outside of her area. I mean, she didn't try and become Attorney General or go into something where she wouldn't have had a hope of mastering. She took the knocks. I mean, she went through, I mean, her lead up to getting the nomination, she had been, let me think, that was 1970, and she'd been in the party for 20 years, steadily, or best part of 20 years. She didn't expect to sort of get there in 5 minutes. She thoroughly worked her pace. And her first chance, you know, the opportunities came, she took them. And I think that a lot of women, especially, take the chance, take the opportunity, don't say no, it may come back. But for some of the blokes on the other side, don't think you can do it all with just charm and noise. You know, you really have to be, if you look at the people in politics, males who've done very well, whether it be John Howard or Robert Menzies or even Guilefoyle, who didn't do so well when he was Prime Minister, but he was okay as a leader. Curtin, these were people who knew politics. They read about politics. They knew the way politics worked. And Menzies, who knew so much the first time round, had to go flat on his face and get up and do it again. And so did John Howard at one point. So it's a long, long road to wherever you're headed in politics. It's a tough road, as you well know, a tough road, tenacity. Margaret, in a sense, didn't have the troubles that some would have. I mean, some would look back and say she had a dream run because she got that nomination and she chose to retire when she wanted to retire. She was in the Senate. Maybe it was she was there at the right time. That can always be a thing in politics. But she was also very loyal to the party. And I think that's a lesson right now that people on the non-Labor side of politics ought to be taking into account. She didn't say she got there because she was Margaret Guilfoyle. She didn't go on Sky News and suggest that she could do it on her own, having made her name from the Liberal Party. She didn't then decide to form a new party or decide to go out and try and get votes with lots of money, as I'm thinking of at the moment with other political figures going around the town at the moment. She knew that she got there because of the party. And she was, to the end, she was loyal. Now, she did believe in the beginning that women didn't need a leg up. By the end, she did. She was very strong in the mid-1990s. She was very strong at supporting all the moves within the Liberal Party, which were very strong at that time, to get women into nominations, to get women. But I think for right now, that is a really big lesson, because there are people who've made their way into the public arena and got a name for themselves only because they were a member of the Liberal Party or member of the National Party. And then they think that they can go out and just do their thing, which doesn't happen to align with whatever it is that the party is doing at the moment, and sing their song and expect people to think that it was all about them. And really, if you're going to do what you're going to get into politics, and I think on the Labor side, they probably force this understanding much more. If you're going to get there through the party, then you've got to understand that you owe the party, and you have to have really, Donship, you have to have really good reasons to leave or to take it on. But you can't be a big name just because you're somebody, Jack Frost or whatever, you know. And she knew that she got there because of the party, and she thought it very well. Mm.
Yeah, well, and of course, Menzies would have known that himself. He'd become politically active, obviously, before the Liberal Party existed, because he created the Liberal Party, the Nationalists, the United Australia Party, but they were parties that were really internally very unhappy and became very unsuccessful. And it was through those, the early 40s, thinking about how do we bring together the non-Labor side of politics, the centre-right, forces, the women's leagues, the, various sort of, in the end it was 18 different groups that came together in 1944 in Albury and Canberra to form the Liberal Party. But, I mean, that was an incredible moment and an incredible set of ideas that has been so long-standing too. And it's bigger, I mean, as is the ALP too. They're bigger than any one individual. They have a set of ideas that people coalesce around. But to think that you are bigger than that organisation and that political philosophy, well, I guess it's it's for those who have an ego. I guess it's
or they forget why they're there, why they became who they are. You know, anyway, that's for them to find out. But I do think that was one of her strengths after she left politics. That it was she always worked for and within the Liberal family.
Yeah, well, just incredible tenacity, hard work, self-belief, but loyalty too, really, as you've so beautifully explained, Anne, and such an incredible role model to us all, Dame Margaret Guilfoyle. So, Anne Henderson, thank you so much for talking to me on the Afternoon Light podcast about Dame Margaret Guilfoyle, Australia's first woman to hold a cabinet-level ministerial portfolio and the first woman to hold a major economic portfolio. What a woman and what an individual. And it's just been wonderful to have this discussion.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Georgina. See you later.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.